that over the last 40 years, a tsunami has come that we weren't aware was coming, that we weren't prepared for, and still haven't grappled with. And that tsunami is chronic disease and food-related illness.
In 40 years?
In 40 years.
Did we have chronic disease prior to this?
We did, of course we did, but not to the magnitude. We used to have like 5% obesity rates in this country in the early 60s. It's 40% now in most states.
I thought it was like 30 like a few years ago.
Nope. It's like
40%.
Many states are 40%. And many are just pushing 40. So it's 35 to 40, depending on where you look at it. Like California's probably less, Colorado's less, but Mississippi and Alabama are, 40 plus. So we have 6 out of every 10 Americans who's got a chronic illness, 4 out of 10 who have more than one. By 10 years from now, we're going to have 83 million with 3 or more chronic diseases: heart disease, diabetes, obesity, cancer, dementia, you name it. We are having 11 million people, and this is, I think, a conservative estimate, 11 million people around the world die every year from bad food, from ultra-processed food and not enough good food. Now, I think it's more like 50 million when you look at all the related conditions and so forth. It's a staggering number that beats out smoking, war, violence, accidents, you name it. Nothing else comes close. Not malaria, TB, AIDS, all that is a fraction, a third of the deaths that are caused by chronic illness. And they're mostly preventable, and they're mostly caused by food, and they're mostly caused by the ultra-processed food that our food system produces en masse. It's the biggest industry on the planet. It's $15 trillion, about 17% of the world's global product, and it is controlled by a few dozen CEOs that are in monopolies around seed production, agrochemicals, fertilizer, processed food companies. It's staggering how the system has sort of just over the last 40 years completely transformed. And I remember like I was in some store or cafe, and I saw this picture of Woodstock, and I'm looking at all the sea of people. And
in the 60s, right?
69. There wasn't one overweight person. I watched this movie, I think it was called Amazing Grace, about Aretha Franklin, African American church. Now, African Americans, 80% of African American women are overweight. It is, they're
80% today.
80%.
Why is that?
Well, because they're targeted by the food industry, because they're in a vicious cycle of economic stress, of social stress, of unfair targeting and manipulation by the food industry. This is well documented by, for example, studies from Yale, where they look at the amount of advertising and targeting to poor and African American, Hispanic communities. It's staggering. And there was not one overweight person in this sea of African Americans in 1970. And so it's literally just happened. I was 11 years old in 1970.
Yeah.
And in my lifetime, you see this change. So we have this staggering problem of chronic illness, which people suffer from, that's bankrupting people, that's bankrupting our country. I mean, think about the amount of economic stress. We talk about...
Well, insurance, too. I mean, so much insurance money that's involved in this, too. People are having to go to the doctor so much more probably now because of these issues, right?
Absolutely. And then many people are not adequately covered, so there's a lot of co-pays. I mean, people can have $10,000, $20,000 in co-pays. I had a patient the other day who, had diabetes, and I fixed his diabetes through food, and he says, I saved $10,000 a year on co-pays for my insulin and my,
just the drug.
Yeah, and when you look at the amount on diabetes spent in this country, which is basically 1 out of every 2 Americans has pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. 1/3 of Medicare spending is on diabetes.
1/3 of Medicare is on diabetes.
Yeah, Medicare, if it was a company, would be the biggest company in the world, $1 trillion budget a year.
Shut up.
Yes, 1/3 of our total federal tax revenue, expected to grow to 100% of our mandatory spending by 2048. And in 6 years, Louis, 6 years, the Medicare Trust Fund, which is sort of the bank account that we use to make sure we cover Medicare, it's a little complicated how it works, but the Medicare Trust Fund is going to be out of money. So that means that we're going to have to get $1 trillion a year out of our tax revenue. We're not covering it.
Oh my gosh.
This is a threat to our economy. It's a threat to our political stability. It's a threat even to national security, Louis, because 7 out of 10 kids who apply for the military get rejected.
Can't get in?
Because they're too fat or unfit
No
to fight.
way.
Yes, there's 700 admirals and generals that published a report called Unhealthy and Unprepared about the threat in our military and national security. And not only that, soldiers are overweight. So we're feeding them crap. They go in Iraq and Afghanistan, the number one reason for for medical evacuations was not war injury, was obesity-related problems.
Come on.
Yes, 100%.
Obesity-related problem? What does that mean? Like
Injury,
like a heart problem?
injuries from being overweight.
Wow.
You know? And you can read about this. I didn't make this shit up. I mean, this is in that report, Unhealthy and Unprepared. Just Google it. You can read it yourself.
Wow.
It's staggering. So we have you know, a $22 trillion debt. We have you know, this threat of chronic disease exploding. It's getting worse and worse. Medicare for all is kind of a silly idea, and so is repealing Obamacare. Neither are going to help the problem unless we figure out how to stop people from going into the system in the first place.
Into the